This video is going to be about filters within Photoshop. I'm going to talk about what they are, how to create one, and the most popular filters for photographers when you're editing your images. So let's start off with the most basic. What is a filter? And a filter is essentially an overlay that you put over the rest of your layers to add certain effects to your image. This could be effects like a blur, you could add noise, you can also do distortions to your image, all sorts of different effects. So with that being said, let me show you what they look like in Photoshop. So if we load up our image here, you can see that the filter menu is located at the top up here. If we click this, you can see all of the different options for filters that we can use. Now, the important thing to know is that many of these filters are primarily for graphic designers, illustrators, and other artists. So there's only certain ones that are going to be really applicable to photography. Let's start off by showing how to create a filter. So let's go ahead and select a fun one. Let's start with the wave filter. So as you can see, we can now create certain waves within the image and apply them how we want. If we hit OK, it's going to go ahead and generate that filter right onto the layer here. So you might be starting to notice a trend here. After we created that filter into that specific pixel layer, those changes are now baked into that layer, which is a no-go because now we can't go back and make changes to that filter or edit it later or even delete that filter if we need to later on. So the solution to this is to duplicate that layer and put the filter over the top of that layer. Let me show you. So if we undo that and we have the original layer here, all we do is duplicate that layer. So we can right click and hit duplicate. We could also hit Control J, or alternatively, if there are a few adjustments already on that layer, say you've made a few changes to it here and there, let's go through and do these two adjustments here. Now what we can do is we could select all of these layers and hit Control Shift Alt E. And what that's going to do is it's going to flatten all the layers selected and put them all into a new layer on the top. So now we can put the filter on this layer right here. The next thing we're going to do is convert this to a smart object. If you go back to the smart objects chapter, you would know that by creating a smart object filter, we can begin to edit that filter later on if we need to. So now this layer is all ready to be filterized. So let's go up and create a filter here. If you go to the top, it will show you the latest filter that you used as a shortcut. So let's go ahead and use that one again and hit OK. So now we can go ahead and edit this filter anytime if we need to by double clicking on this. See, now we can go back and change the wavelength, the amplitude, the scale, literally whatever we want to do there. And it will now apply that filter right there. We can also decrease the opacity of this filter if we need to. Say I want to have like a bit more of a textured effect for whatever reason. Another thing you could do is you can create masks. So if we create a mask here, I can now begin to paint that filter in wherever I want that filter to show. Say I want that filter only in the sky, make it look like some kind of digitalized matrix sky. We can go ahead and do that there. Alternatively, you could also mask the smart filter right here, which is very similar, but it just allows you a bit more creative control within your edit. So that's the very basics about how to create a filter in Photoshop. Now let's get into some of the more popular filters that you're actually going to use when you're editing your photos. So let's go ahead and delete all of this and start with this image here. We're going to go ahead and start with the adaptive wide angle filter here, which is a great filter for correcting distortions from a super wide angle lens. I believe this photo was taken at 17 millimeters. And as you can see, if you zoom in, the horizon isn't perfectly level. It's a bit curved like that. So what we can do is go ahead and create a filter. So we'll duplicate that, convert it to a smart object, And now let's go to the adaptive wide angle filter here. Now, as you can see, all we have to do to level this horizon is click on the corner and then begin to drag along the horizon here. And Photoshop is going to realize and notice that this is a horizon, which is why it is a bit curved. So we can now go ahead and click there, and it will automatically straighten that horizon for us. So now we've corrected that wide angle lens. We can also go ahead and scale this if we need to, or we can decrease the scale and say okay on that. All right, so now we have that horizon fixed, but these corners still aren't filled in yet. As you can see, it's taking that bottom layer and putting it over there. So in order to fill these corners, we're gonna go ahead and convert this back into a pixel layer where we can use content aware fill. So let's go ahead and hit Control J to duplicate this layer, right click, rasterize layer to convert to a pixel layer. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and select all of these corners up here. We're gonna make sure this is selected so we can add to that selection. And notice how I'm selecting a little bit of the sky. We want to use a little bit of the image as a sample so that Photoshop notices and can apply the content aware fill to it correctly. So now we got those corners selected. Let's go to content aware fill. And make sure this is all good to go. I think it should be good. Yeah, it looks good, so we don't even really need to do much there. So let's go ahead and click OK. All right, deselect, and now we have a perfectly filled image right here. And here are those edges if we want to take out or remove them. It didn't capture that spot right there, so one thing we could do is just go in here and use a heal tool and fill that in right there. Boom! So that is the adaptive wide angle filter, good for those weird lens distortions. Let's go ahead and hop to the second filter that you might use, which is the camera raw filter. So let's pop to this image here, and let's go ahead and create a smart filter for this. So we're going to duplicate that layer, right click, convert to smart object, and let's go to the camera raw filter. Now, you might recognize the camera raw filter from a few of the other videos we have done. It is essentially just Lightroom within Photoshop, except the catch is when you're using it as a filter, you're now not making raw adjustments because it isn't linked to that raw image. The only way to actually make raw adjustments in Photoshop is to open it as a smart object from Lightroom to Photoshop. Since we're using it as a filter, we could only use the options within Lightroom or Camera Raw. So this is good if you're familiar with Lightroom and there's a few tools that you like in particular here. Say you really like the color mixer here. You like being able to make these kind of changes like to the yellow or to the orange. A lot of these tools are available in Photoshop, but they're under different tool sets, so they work a little bit differently. So if you're just used to using Lightroom, then this is a good way to feel at home and apply some of those features to your image. Let's go ahead and hop to another filter that I use quite frequently. It is called the Liquify tool. So let's go ahead and use this image here. We're going to duplicate that, convert to smart object, and now let's go and select the Liquify tool. So technically this tool is very good for editing bodies. A lot of people use this for portraits to reconstruct faces, to move things over, to bloat things, to contrast things, but it's also really great for landscapes, particularly objects like rocks. So I'm gonna go through the three main tools that I use here. The first tool is up here and is called the Forward Warp tool. So if we go in here, I can now push little things over and just nudge things into place a bit more. So say I want to make these rocks look a bit taller or like they're a bit more balanced, I can go ahead and nudge this stuff over here. Very basic corrections. It just allows you to push things over a little bit here and there. The second tool that I like to use is called the Pucker tool. And what this tool does is it makes things smaller. So since we got rocks in here, say I want to make this rock smaller, I could click on it and it will begin to pucker that rock or make it smaller. As you can see what I'm doing here. The third tool I like to use is the opposite of that, which is called the bloat tool. So this will allow me to make rocks bigger or more bloated. So wherever you click on a certain rock, it'll go ahead and make it pop a bit more. So as you can see, we can really start to make this a weird looking landscape here and add a bit more drama to these already fairly dramatic rocks here. So that's generally how you use the liquefy tool. Say you mess up though, you can go ahead and backtrack. So if you click this bottom option here and go to reconstruct, you will be brought up with this menu here. If you drag this back, you can see everything will return back to normal, and you could select the point where you want to drag it back to normal. So I could hit OK there. There's also a few brush tools here if you want to change the size of your brush, but that's pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and hit OK, and that filter is done. If I want to make edits, I can obviously click on this and go ahead and re-edit that later on. So that is the liquefy tool. The fourth filter that I want to go over is the blur tool, which is probably the filter you're going to be using the most. So let's go ahead and start with a basic blur here. So we're going to duplicate this, convert to smart object, and let's go ahead and pop up to the blur. The first blur we're going to want to look at is the Gaussian blur, which is basically a general blur over your entire image. So when we click on that, it's going to bring up this menu where we can select the radius, which is AKA how blurry do we want this to be. So let's go ahead and do 4 there. Now, I'm not going to want to apply this to the entire image. A general rule of thumb is you want to apply blur to where there's more light. And this gets into the Orton effect a bit, but we're going to get into that a bit more specifically later on. So say I want to just add more blur over here to add a bit of a soft light glow to that. I can now create a mask there and invert that and begin to paint in that blur where I want it. So let's just paint it in over here. And now we're going to start to have a very subtle light blur popping in this corner over here. Another thing we could do is we can change the blend mode to soft light too, which will edit that even more. So if we want to, we can decrease that a little bit. And now we're getting a nice blur in that corner over there. That's just softening that light a little bit and making it a little less harsh. So that's the first blur tool you're probably going to use. The second blur tool you might use is motion blur. So let's go ahead and undo all of that. So what I want to do with this image is add a little bit of motion blur to the water. So as you can see, it's a bit of a choppy ocean here. And since this is such a soft, glowy image, I want to start to simulate a longer exposure, which I didn't in this image. So now I need to figure out how to add motion blur just to that water here. So the first step you would think would be to create a smart object, go up and add some motion blur, which is right here. And let's say we want to blur the water like that. Now we want to paint this only into the ocean. So let's create a mask there, invert that, and we can start to paint this into the ocean here. And that's starting to look pretty good. The only problem here is you can see it's starting to blur these edges of the cliff with the water. So now we're getting this weird halo edge where the water is meeting these cliffs here, which is a no-go. We don't want that layer of must on the edges there because it's just going to start to look tacky. So we need to figure out how to isolate the water on its own separately from the cliffs. So let's go ahead and undo all of this again. And we're just going to start with a normal pixel layer here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a selection of all of these cliffs here. And I'm gonna do this fairly fast. Obviously, if you were doing this for real, you would probably want to make a bit more of an accurate selection, but I wanna show you just the basics of how this works. So we're gonna pop through this fairly quickly here. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. So now that that is all selected, only the cliffs, we're gonna go ahead and save that selection here with that mask button. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new layer. We're gonna copy this selection with Control C. Whoops, we gotta have the layer selected. Control C, and we're gonna paste it into this new layer here. So this new layer is only the cliffs. Now we need another layer that is only the water. So we're gonna go back to this selection here, get that selected, and now we're gonna invert that selection with Control Shift I. So now only the water and the sky is selected. So now we're gonna go ahead and copy that selection and paste it to a new layer, which is only the water. So we'll call this layer the water and this layer the cliffs. So the next thing we wanna do is we want to expand this layer a bit so that the water comes out a bit more. And when we can go through and make the blur on it, it's going to not take into account these empty areas here. So first let's select this middle area here and edit content aware fill. And this doesn't have to be burr perfect. It's not gonna look amazing. So let's just get a general idea of, there we go. We're gonna be blurring this anyway, so it doesn't have to look perfect. Hit apply there. Okay, and now we got that area filled. All right, so now we have that. We're gonna go ahead and combine that layer with the layer below so we can get a bigger ocean sample here. And the next thing we're gonna do is do a content aware fill for these edges down here. Let's go ahead and drag this baby. Like that. Edit, content aware fill. And let's do the high color adaptation again. And that's looking pretty good. So let's hit OK. All right, let's go ahead and merge these two layers right here. And now this is the layer that we want to do the motion blur on. So we're gonna duplicate that, turn it into a smart object, go up to filter, blur, and go to motion blur. And now we got this nice, sexy blur we can apply to this image here. Let's click that and see what it looks like. And now let's go ahead and paste the cliffs on top. And that's looking not bad. It is looking a little bit edgy here. So one thing we could do to blend these edges a bit more is we can go ahead to this layer and make a little bit of a mask here and start to mask these edges a little bit just so it blends with the ground a bit more and it doesn't look nearly as pasted in. Because you do get a little bit of texture when water does hit those corners like that. So let's get those edited in there, maybe right here a little bit as we get these edges in the corner. All right, so that's looking much better. So now we have that nice blur of the ocean here, and I could go ahead and control that, how much blur I really want in the scene here. If I want to completely get rid of it, I can go ahead and do that or edit it like that. So that is how you can use motion blur as a filter. I know that was a ton of steps and it got fairly complicated with the selections there, but I really want to show you the potential of that tool if you need it. It can also be applied towards waterfalls, rivers, streams, all sorts of stuff. It just requires a lot of very careful selecting and really tuning that motion blur to be at the perfect level. So now let's move on to another filter that I want to talk about, which is the noise filter. More specifically, adding noise to an image. Now you're probably wondering why I would want to add noise to an image, and let me show you. Now we have this image here that I took a while ago. If you zoom into this shipwreck in the background, you can see that it almost looks a little bit plastic, or like it was rendered in 3D or something. It doesn't look like an image. And the reason it looks like this is because I did a bit of over editing. I believe I did a sky replacement when I fixed this image up, and I tried to blend it with the moving sand and the textures of the ground, and I did some kind of smoothing blur technique that ended up just getting rid of all of the noise and sharpness there and just really making it not look that realistic. So in order to do this, we're gonna create another layer, convert to Smart Object, and we're gonna go to Filter, Noise, and add noise here. So let's go ahead and find the part of the ship that we want to add noise to, which is right here, and see what this amount does. That's a little bit much. We just want it to be really subtle here, just enough to make it look a bit more realistic. So let's see what that looks like. That's starting to look a little bit better here. Obviously, we're gonna want to create a mask here and mask this in because we don't need that extra noise in this front tire here. So let's go ahead and paint this noise in. There we go, and see what it looks like. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad. Starting to get a little bit of texture back in it. And since this is a smart filter, we can always go through and see what it looks like. Yeah, that's looking pretty good, I think. Another tool we can use is called the high pass filter. And this is similar to sharpen, but I would say it's even closer to a clarity or texture adding tool. It's really great for rocks if you want to make them look a bit more rough. For example, we have this image right here, which I figured would be perfect. So let's go ahead and duplicate that. Make it a smart object and head up to the filters here. And it is located in other under high pass here. And this layer is a bit different than the other ones. So you're gonna have to use a blending mode to make this work, which is why it's gonna look gray right now. So let's pop this radius up a bit, and you can see these are the parts of the image where it's gonna add texture to them. So let's click OK. And we have to change this to a soft light blend mode or an overlay. Overlay does it a bit harder. I usually do the soft light blend mode. So now, as you can see, that's adding more texture to those rocks there. And we could reduce that even more if we want. Let's go like that. And I think that's pretty good there. And those are all of the filters that I really wanted to go over. As you can see, there's a ton of filters in here that you could use. I don't really go through and use a lot of these other ones. You can experiment with them, but I haven't found many that are very practical for landscape or even street photography, besides all the ones I've showed you. For example, like lens correction, we mainly do that in Lightroom anyway, so we don't need to do that. Distortions are a little crazy, 3D isn't applicable, you know, pixelate and render. Lens flare can be okay if you want to add like a little bit of lens flare to your image, but I honestly just don't do that very much. It looks a little bit tacky in my opinion. So yeah, those are all the filters. Feel free to experiment with more and honestly just practice. The more you do practice with these, the more familiar you're gonna get. And yeah, let's hop to the next video.